Greetings, students, and welcome to Chapter 11, Keywords and Concepts on Personality. So this is probably going to be the most we're ever going to cover Freud in this class. But here we are. Okay, so personality is the long-standing traits and patterns that propel individuals to consistently think, feel, and behave in specific ways, right? So it's what makes you you. And these are the traits, patterns. These are not things that you are going to change likely over long periods of time, although we'll talk about that. So Freud had this notion of layers of the psyche, right? There's that lovely drawing in your textbook of the iceberg, right? Where only part of it kind of sticks up and out. So the unconscious id that's underneath the iceberg contains our most primitive drives and urges, right? It's present from birth. This is hunger, thirst, sex, violence, the stuff, right? The most primitive man things, man and woman things. So that's the id. The superego acts as our conscious, right? This is Jiminy Cricket in our head. That's part of the part that's up and out. It's our moral compass that tells us how we should behave. And then finally, we have the ego. This is the rational part of our personality. It's the part that we show the world, right? That's the part that's completely out of the iceberg. And it's kind of negotiating between the id and the superego all the time, right? Is trying to figure out how much we're going to let ourselves do the things we want to do over the things we should do. And he would theorize that people who were dominated by id were like the worst humans on earth, that people who were dominated by the superego were those really obnoxious moralizers, things like that. And another concept that he brought up, but that still occurs in terms of a psychological defense mechanism, is what's known as regression. And this is when an individual acts much younger than their age. For those of you who have children, actually, this is probably the easiest one for you to witness in your children. When they're afraid or upset, even if they're elementary school age, you'll sometimes see them going back to behaviors you probably haven't seen in a while, like thumb sucking or that kind of thing. Same idea happens the entire way through life, right? Whole way through life, we will, as a defense mechanism, go back to being children when we didn't have to deal with the world. Okay? So let's move on to the next slide here. And these are talking about various psychologists in the 20th century and what they contributed to personality theory. So we learned about Dr. Adler, and one of his major contributions to personality psychology was the idea that our birth order shapes our personality. Now, this was incredibly popular, but unfortunately, it really hasn't been proven about birth order. But any of those stereotypes you've heard about, the oldest child being bossy, the youngest child being rebellious, that kind of thing, that's kind of where this comes from. So, interesting idea, hasn't really been borne out in the research, but we keep coming back to it anyway. You also learned about Erik Erikson and his psychosocial theory of development, the idea being that a person's personality develops throughout their lifespan, right? And this is very different than what Freud thought. He thought you were kind of fixed in your personality at age like 3 or 4. And that's just fundamentally untrue, right? We all have different experiences. We go through different things in life, different groups of people, all kinds of things. Your personality is going to develop throughout your lifespan. And then Carl Jung, possibly one of my favorites of these, and his notion of the persona, which he referred to as a mask that we adopt, right? This is the idea that we consciously create a person that we want to project to the world that isn't necessarily us, right? That isn't necessarily who we really are, but it's what we want the world to see. And it comes from both our conscious experiences and his notion of the collective unconscious, which we're not really going to get into, but you should be familiar with Jung and the persona. All right, I'll see you in the next video.